Once upon a time, in a magical land called Lodz, a great storyteller named Sapkowski wove an epic tale of magic, romance, betrayal, and gratuitous nudity called The Witcher. The story became world famous in Poland, telling the story of the Witcher Geralt, his ward Ciri, and all the women he slept with. Then the book became a video game series that continued the novels, and a TV series that raised a lot of questions, like, what was the backstory of Ciri and Yennefer? How much better could this show have been if they had had an actual budget? Would it have killed someone to have a Slavic accent? And remind me again, but isn't Poland one of the least ethnically diverse nations in all of Europe? But with the cooperation of Talsorian, the makers of Cyberpunk, and CD Projekt Red, the maker of the Witcher games, a tabletop RPG was destined to be made. And that's the topic on this Mad Musings, the Witcher RPG. I'm Mr. Welch, and unlike Geralt, I will not try to get through this video in as few syllables as possible. The Witcher RPG came out in 2018 and was created by Cody and Lisa Pondsmith, keeping the game in the Pondsmith family. The cover art was done by David Raposa, with a legion of interior artists, the majority of which I would embarrass myself trying to pronounce their last names. Polish is not my first language, and I'm not going to try to fake it. The art in the book is second to none, but you'll recognize a large amount of it recycled from the computer games. The story behind The Witcher is that in centuries past, all the worlds aligned in something called the Conjunction of the Spheres, releasing all sorts of magic on the world. Humans arrived from another planet during this event and quickly spread across the world, becoming the dominant culture. Magic was discovered, and everybody soon settled down and got to the business of hating each other. Long ago, when monsters were far more numerous, witchers were created, men who were given a magical treatment to turn them into something more than human, and they hunted down the monsters. Then people started hating them because they'd hunted down most of the monsters, and now people feared their own creation. There's a lot of hating each other in this game. Mechanically, the game uses a modified system of the Cyberpunk 2020 game. The system has been used numerous times for other games, including Mechton, but this was their first use of it in a fantasy setting as Castle Falkenstein and used an entirely different mechanical base. It's a class system, but uses a stat skill mechanic rather than a level system like similar fantasy RPGs. There's different races, initially human, elf, dwarf, and witcher, but other races were added in the various supplements. It has the same stats as Cyberpunk, though cool is dropped entirely and tech is renamed to craftsmanship. It did strike me as odd that the character generation system was placed a bit back in the book, which meant you had sections talking about stats and mechanics that hadn't been introduced yet, but that's a minor gripe. Like Cyberpunk, there's a variety of different classes, specifically Bard, Craftsman, Criminal, Doctor, Mage, Man-at-Arms, Merchant, Priest, and Witcher. Or as my friends call them, Fantasy Rocker Boy, Fantasy Tech, Fantasy Fixer, Fantasy Medtech, and you get the idea. For people that played Cyberpunk, the similarities to the game cannot be ignored. Not that it's a bad thing, the mechanics work, no reason not to recycle them. Plus, nobody is running to the fridge for a snack break when the mage starts working magic, unlike the Netrunner. Every class gets you a set of starting skills, a class ability, and some starting gear, similar to Cyberpunk Red. Pick your race, pick your class, and get ready to determine your family background. Life paths are taken straight from Cyberpunk, only without the chance of having nothing happen in a given year. The Witcher world is a far more interesting setting than Night City, so there's no chance of having a boring year. There's two ways to do it. Roll your character randomly or select your history. You're not going to min-max a super character using these charts. So if you have an experienced player that knows how they want to play their character, there's no problem with just letting them pick their options until the mandatory random events start happening. Your starting country or region gets you a +1 to a specific skill, which is more of a cosmetic advantage, to be honest. Then you move on to your family to see how big it is, how important it is, and if it's still alive. Then you determine the number of siblings you have, and the game suggests that when you die, just play one of them. Assuming the background didn't kill them off, have them imprisoned, or have them be the one responsible for killing you. And since witchers and mages have much longer lifespans and are infertile, there's a good chance your family is long dead by the time the game even starts. The game's basic mechanic is stat plus skill. A reflex of 7 and a melee of 6 gives you base 13 points, and then you add a d10 to that. Not a complex system, though it does fall into dueling dice when it comes to systems like combat. A 10 explodes, so there's a chance anybody can beat anybody at least once in a contested roll. A critical fumble isn't as drastic as you roll again and just subtract that roll from your total. When rolling to see if you succeed against things that aren't resisting you, the target number is static, so there's no dice off. A major part of the class system is the skill tree. Each class has its own special skill that can only be taken by that class, and these skills give additional advantages beyond normal skills. These are less like subclasses and more like multi-tiered skill systems. You can spend the points to gain advantages from each tree or just go all in on one branch. It's up to you, and there's no wrong way to do it. Bear in mind that some skill trees require a large amount of downtime, especially in the craftsman skill tree, because of the extra needed time to create or repair items. That's been a problem with crafting classes no matter the game, and it's no different in The Witcher. There is a lot of magic in The Witcher, as you can expect. Witchers have signs, mages have spells, and priests have invocations. Magic is pretty simple mechanically, using a typical magic point system derived from your stats. You cast spells from stamina, and you recover stamina by resting, often in the middle of combat. There's a danger to casting spells, just like swinging a sword. If you fail by a certain margin, you suffer the consequences depending on the type of spell. The better you are at Magic, the harder it is for you to critically fail, which is a nice change from games with a set failure percentage. Cyberpunk had this problem. There was a 10% chance you would fail no matter what. With The Witcher, you can roll a 1, and if you're already very skilled in trying to do a simple task, you're not going to fail unless things go catastrophically wrong. Of course, since it's the Witcher RPG, the game has oodles of combat rolls. It's based on the video game, after all, where by the time you finally beat that game, Geralt has probably hit quadruple digits in the number of people he's killed. As you can expect, it's the largest chapter in the whole book as far as mechanics go. The game warns you several times that if you get into combat a lot, you're going to be making a new character sooner than later. You do have a set amount of hit points as a derived stat, but even if you're a strapping mountain of a man, you're going to go down in a few hits if unarmored. There's no monks in The Witcher for a reason. Combat is normally dueling dice. When you attack, you roll a d10, add your appropriate stat plus skill, and your opponent does the same thing for defense. If they roll higher, you miss. If you roll higher, you hit. If you roll a lot higher, you critically hit. The more you beat their roll by, the better the critical hit chart you get to roll on. You can even auto-kill bad guys if you completely overwhelm their defense. If you win by 7 points, you get to roll on the regular critical chart. If you beat it by 15, you get to roll on the deadly critical chart, and there's 2 critical charts in between those 2 numbers. Of course, there's critical misses, which happens if you roll a 1, and then you roll a second die and subtract that from your base stat plus skill. If the new result is now 0, you critically fumble and roll on the chart. But what this usually means is that Master Swordsmen can become critical hit machines against low-skill foes. Combat is ridiculously deadly, as there are a lot of multipliers for damage. You have 2 options to attack: a fast attack, which lets you attack twice at normal damage, and a heavy attack that's a single swing with a penalty to hit but does double damage. If you attack with a damage source that a target is vulnerable to, like monsters are with silver, you get to double it again. If you manage to hit your opponent in the head, you triple that damage. As you can see, you can one-shot on a lucky roll rather easily, so wear a helmet. As monsters all take double damage from silver, that means the party is going to load up on silver weapons. This creates a bit of a break between story and gameplay, as silver weapons are one of the defining traits of a Witcher, but if the characters are going to have any hope of fighting monsters, they're going to need silver. Most characters, once they have a bit of gold, are going to make a beeline to the nearest craftsman to get a weapon coated in silver. And it's hard to argue against them doing that, because getting up to 5d6 bonus damage against a monster that's then doubled will help you stay alive longer in the world of The Witcher. One aspect that might turn players away from the game is there's a lot of bookkeeping when it comes to equipment maintenance. When you take damage, your armor stops a certain amount, but then the stopping power is reduced by a point. When you parry an attack, your weapon endurance again is reduced by a point. Shields can only take so many hits before they stop working. You can also damage your weapon on a critical fumble, and some weapons and effects will reduce armor effectiveness even faster. So as you adventure, your equipment is going to get worse over time. While weapons, this might not be a problem because you can draw a second blade or such, you aren't taking a spare suit of plate mail with you when you go to fight the Leshen. You're going to be spending a chunk of your reward getting your gear back up to normal after every adventure. It's not a lot of extra paperwork, but it does seem to put off more than a few people. Magic is based on the Vigor ability, which is normally restricted to mages, priests, and to a lesser extent witchers. This matches up with the difficulty of casting spells. Casting a spell with a higher Vigor requirement than you currently have is going to cost you some health, with a chance of very bad things happening if you roll badly. You can raise your Vigor through class skills like Divine Power for priests or In Touch for wizards, which is something you will definitely want to do quickly if you're going to play a spellcaster of any significant power. Wizards can't use armor very well, except for, of course, witchers, but Witcher signs aren't nearly as powerful as normal spells. Because you can't wear armor, you are soft and squishy. Mages tend to avoid combat or have a lot of people between them and the bad guys. Another major part of the game that has multiple pages devoted to it is Alchemy and Crafting. If you want to make magical potions, bombs, or similar, you have to acquire all the required components. The game uses a composite system with the various ingredients shown as colored symbols, so instead of having to memorize a list of items you have to collect, you just collect items of the required color. So, an acid solution requires you to find 3 purple, 1 yellow, 1 green, and 1 blue component. The Game Master will tell you what ingredients you find when you carve up the monsters or scour the forest for components. It's not a bad way to handle a complex ingredient list, though most players will remember the components by their color code rather than their actual name. Crafting is similar, but in this case you have to keep track of all the components necessary. Like the video game, you have to find the schematics if there are a rare weapon design, or just a weapon design not common in the area you're in. Once you know how to make a dwarven hammer, then you have to go find a craftsman who's skilled enough to create the weapon. Of course, the party's craftsmen can do it, but you're going to require a lot of downtime as they forge a new sword or piece of armor, and God help you if they need to enchant it. Just saying, character classes that require significant downtime to perform their basic tasks have always been a problem, and The Witcher is no different from Deadlands, 7th Sea, or D&D in this regard. There are optional verbal combat rules, which are recommended especially for new players. These rules give you a new stat to keep track of, resolve, which is like mental hit points. These refresh every time you get into a verbal combat, so you just have to remember what your starting level is before you go into an argument. You can try to seduce, persuade, convince, or befriend the target if you're trying to be nice, or deceive, ridicule, or provoke your target if you have ulterior motives. They have a variety of ways to defend against your words, but if they're inclined to agree with you, then the test becomes just a basic test. You don't have to try that hard to convince the guard looking for an excuse to fight. This being a Witcher game, there is a section on romance and sex, which is more of a warning to game masters that asking if you can do all the girls at the bar and actually role-playing doing all the girls at the bar are two very different things. It does have a section talking about how not to make romance weird, but if you're dealing with the typical gamer, it's gonna get weird no matter what. This is a game that has succubi. It's gonna get real weird. The trick is to keep the squick factor to a minimum. Waking up wearing Duchess Anna Henrietta's corset is fine, but leave the part out about earning it to the bare details. There are a lot of NPCs in the core rulebook from Witcher lore, though Ciri is conspicuously absent. That's probably because her powers are well beyond the scope of the game. It's a bit odd regarding who's in the game compared to who's left out for supplements. Lambert, Eskel, and Vesemir don't make the cut, but somehow Letho does. You got Yennefer and Triss, obviously, but they leave out Shani, which of course is the only real romance option for Geralt. Actually, most of the characters come from the second video game, with the exception of Yennefer, as it does include Yorveth and Roche, but Vess is noticeably missing as her and Vernon Roche are usually attached at the hip. Almost all these NPCs will outclass most parties for some time. Not that I would suggest fighting them, but if they accompany the party for any length of time, remember to throw some baddies just for them to fight, making their destruction of most of the bandits more cinematic, but leaving stuff for your party to do. If Vernon Roche isn't along for the ride, neither are the extra bandits. That's just an old DM trick to keep plot-mandated god-tier NPC escorts from dominating a combat unfairly. The game does go into a bit of detail on the politics of the North, with the freedom-loving northern kingdoms happily doing their own Slavic customs like politicking, drinking, and slaughtering each other. Then there's the dour and unfunny Dutch in the form of the Nilfgaard, with their customs and hobbies, which include politicking, ordering their clothes from the Wednesday Addams fashion line, and slaughtering the northern kingdoms. On an aside, you want to represent a country who's known for being serious all the time and constantly straight-faced, and you decide that they need to speak Dutch. Granted, the Elder speech and a few other languages are straight-up Welsh, so as long as it sounds right, go with it. A little language lesson. Gwynblythe is literally Welsh for white wolf, though the order is reversed, as in Cymraeg, they put the adjective after the noun, so it would be Blythe Gwyn. But that doesn't roll off the tongue as easily, though. The Witcher isn't a bad game at all, though some of the elements will put off gamers that aren't used to such a high degree of lethality in a fantasy game. I didn't go into all the powers of The Witcher because I don't want to spoil the whole game, but they are notoriously lethal, and they can make a lot of the other martial classes like Man-at-Arms feel superfluous. Fair warning on that one. Several Witchers in a single campaign will drop all but the toughest monsters very quickly. There are numerous supplements that add to the game and the setting, and I do recommend them if you're going all in on it. This game grew on me. I'm not totally sold on some of the game mechanics, like the silver rush to weaponry, but it's unique as a fantasy game goes compared to most of what else is out there. Next Mad Musings, I'm looking at TSR's answer to Traveler, Alternity. It was the wrong answer, but at least they tried. But until then, shining, armor and wings, death from above, it's an army of kings.